We've seen a shift over the last 20 years in conferences whereby the conferences haven't been able to identify a single band or a single set of bands, and we've had a more of a sort of a breakdown of that kind of uniform approach. However, I don't think that harms the IMT industry from that perspective. I think there is still a large number of countries that have signalled their intention to use those bands.
Welcome to this podcast on the World Radio Conference, or WRC 23, which took place just a few weeks ago in Dubai. I'm William Webb. I'm the CTO here at Access Partnership, and I've got a colleague here, Mike Thompson, who heads up our space practice and was actually at the event. I was just a bystander remotely. So, Mike, you spent 4 weeks in Dubai. Tell me a bit about how the overall conference felt, how it went, and was it similar to previous years? This is the seventh for you. Is it something like that or something?
It was my ninth. Good morning, William. Yeah, no, it was my ninth conference, and each one is different. Each one has its own character. This one was a little unusual. A lot of them have been hosted in Geneva by the ITU, so the facilities are kind of well known. This was hosted by the government of the UAE, and they made, I have to say, a very good effort to organise a very slick and very well run conference. So, in terms of the administration and the running of the conference, it was really second to none. It was really excellent. The conference was different in a couple of respects, not least of which, of course, it's followed on from a period of COVID and at least 2 years of the study period, which would normally be used to develop the technical discussions and begin developing the consensus, was lost because we were unable to meet face-to-face, and the ability to sort of meet using virtual methods meant that we didn't have anything like the amount of time to sit and discuss the issues at hand. So from that point of view, I think we arrived at the conference perhaps not as well prepared as we have for previous conferences. But I have to say, I think everyone arrived in the same spirit as usual, with particular goals and obviously an engagement to follow up with, and the organisation of the conference, I think, made the most of the opportunity that we had then to look at the various agenda items.
And from afar, at least, one of the key agenda items was what's called agenda item 1.2, looking at the upper 6 gigahertz band and what went on there, and a lot of pressure from two different camps, from what's called the IMT camp, the cellular operators, trying hard to gain that spectrum for future 5G and into 6G usage, and then equally from the Wi-Fi camp, trying to gain the whole of the 6 gigahertz band because they already have the bottom half of it for Wi-Fi usage. And that was a very heated debate in the run-up to WRC. My observation from afar has been that the outcome we've got is a bit bodged in a way. It's not one or the other. It's not all given to cellular. It's not all given to Wi-Fi. There's a lot of regional differences. So in region 1, broadly Europe, Middle East, Africa, then there is an element of giving it to IMT, but also a number of caveats that say, but it can be used for other things that are already in there. In region 2, the US and South America, broadly not, except Mexico and Brazil, which get opt-outs. And then in region 3, which includes China and Asia Pacific, only the very upper slither of it to IMT, despite the fact that China itself wanted to have the whole of the band for IMT, and probably will use the whole band for IMT. And this feels like a complex use of national and regional opt-outs and changes, which to some degree makes the whole purpose of getting together to come to a collective agreement somewhat pointless. Is that how it felt a bit to you, that it was heading down this road of fragmentation as you looked at what was going on there?
Well, I think, yes, I think the nature of IMT identifications are maybe different to other things that are done at a conference. So a conference generally looks at allocations for a particular service, the mobile service or a satellite service, and the conditions that are attached to it. For IMT, it's a little different. Most of these bands were already identified for mobile use, and in theory, administrations have the right to go and use those allocations already for their domestic purposes. They can use them already for IMT if they decide to do so. So from that point of view, the conference wasn't really looking to make a new allocation. It was looking to try, as you put it, to try and find a common usage, or not common allocation is the wrong word, but a common usage of the band for IMT, in order to, of course, to benefit the economies of scale that come with building equipment for that band, for those bands. So from that point of view, we've seen a shift over the last 20 years in conferences whereby the conferences haven't been able to identify a single band or a single set of bands, and we've had more of a sort of a breakdown of that kind of uniform approach. However, I don't think that harms the IMT industry from that perspective. I think there is still a large number of countries that have signalled their intention to use those bands, and I think that should give the IMT industry enough comfort to go build the equipment for those particular bands. Of course, what will happen, perhaps more importantly, is now to look at the administrations and how they choose to implement, at what speed they choose to implement IMT in those bands. Of course, in some countries there are still other services, other systems operating there, and it won't necessarily be the same speed. Let's say for a country in Europe and a country in Africa might be at different speeds because they have different needs or different demands on spectrum for those particular bands.
Yes, I agree. It feels like what this has done is, to a fair extent, push things back to individual countries and said to them, broadly, you can more or less do what you want, actually, within the framework of what's been agreed. And that's a sensible thing, I think, because there's not a lot of cross-border interference issues going to occur here compared to things like satellite use or VHF use or otherwise. The frequencies are high enough that it can probably be fairly well contained or coordinated across the borders. So it does mean national countries can do what they want. And to your point about economies of scale for cellular, broadly those are more important in the early days of cellular when there were very few bands and it was expensive to put additional bands into handsets. Now we see handsets with 40, 50, sometimes even 70 or 80 different frequency bands within them. So adding another band or taking it away is not a big challenge anymore for a handset. So it feels actually almost that this didn't really need to come to WRC in a way, and maybe it's the start of a change where WRC will concentrate more on the issues that really do need to be looked at internationally, like satellites. And I know that was some of the ones you were particularly focusing on. Do you want to talk us through what happened in some of the satellite areas?
Yeah, indeed. It was an interesting conference from the perspective of the satellite industry. One of probably the headline item was Agenda Item 117, which looked at satellite-to-satellite links. And the studies there were looking at the possible use of parts of KU and KA band, which are heavily used now by satellite systems for high capacity VSAT and other types of service, to be able to use those same frequency bands for space-to-space links. So this is for applications such as, let's say, weather monitoring satellites or Earth exploration satellites, the kind of Earth exploration that NASA and the European Space Agency, for example, undertake. So those kinds of missions using low Earth orbiting satellites actually generate huge amounts of data, and getting the data down from a low Earth orbiting satellite to ground is actually quite a challenge. It requires a lot of capacity. And there has been a shift in the industry, I should say, particularly with the space science industry, to move now to commercial capacity and try and utilize the capacity of some of these big systems, big capacity systems that have been built. And so, as has happened in other fields, the organizations are now looking to actually contract with the likes of the big satellite operators to provide that capacity constantly. If we look at an operator such as, let's say, SES, they have I think in excess of 50 geostationary satellites around the globe. They can provide near constant coverage for these types of applications. Smaller operators can provide perhaps regional coverage, but they can do so at a much reduced cost, and they can provide much better capacity, much more cost-effective capacity for these kind of applications. So it's unlikely to replace or displace other uses of satellite for VSAT or for internet access or even for broadcast, but it is likely to supplement the use of that of that capacity that's being built. And of course, I should also say that the agenda item recognised that there are non-geostationary satellite constellations also coming into operations now, and those project quite large capacity increases, and again that will have an impact, a downward impact on the cost of the per megabyte for this data to be actually transmitted from a sensor in space down to Earth to be processed.
So it effectively gets sent from the sensor satellite to another satellite in order for it to then be downloaded in a standard.
Otherwise, the old way of doing it was to have a network of ground stations on the ground, which will be constantly streaming data from the low Earth orbiting satellite to ground. That's expensive and requires a lot of maintenance, of course, to maintain a global network. And with geostationary satellites pretty much in view for most of a LEO's orbit, it makes far more sense to operate that way.
Yeah. No, I mean, that sounds like a really sensible thing for WRC to do, to allow new commercial ways of doing things in a way that doesn't materially cause interference to other existing uses.
And I think maybe that last point is actually is worth noting. The focus of the study was actually protecting the existing usage. So obviously these systems were set up to serve ground to satellite and satellite to ground links. And the use for space-to-space links need to operate within that constraint and not be in any way sort of impinging on the primary use of these type of satellite resources.
And you mentioned LEOs and the growing LEO constellations, but LEOs didn't get everything their way at the conference, did they? So in particular, I think some of the bigger networks, Starlink and Kuiper and others, were pushing for a recalculation of the interference that they might cause if they're operating in the same band as GEO satellites. And that didn't go quite to plan, as I understand it.
No, a little surprisingly, in my view. So each WRC sets the agenda for the forthcoming, for the next WRC, in this case, WRC 2027, and it begins the studies then for those agenda items to be considered in 4 years' time. The industry behind the non-geostationary constellations were looking to rebalance the protection they need to give to geostationary satellites. The existing regulatory regime places a higher importance on protection of the geostationary orbits than it does on the use of the non-geostationary orbits. And that has many historical reasons going back to the advent of the geostationary orbit back in the 1960s. However, with the sort of the huge increase in capacity that's being promised by these non-geostationary systems, there have been pushes by the industry to actually look and reevaluate whether the relative protection for geostationary and non-geostationary need to be rebalanced. And so the proposal was made to actually start the studies and consider it at WRC 27. Interestingly, though, that was rejected and that wasn't agreed. And although studies may begin in the ITU, there will be no agenda item considering it at WRC 27. So there will be no change in the regulatory regime in 4 years' time. My view on that is that perhaps it was a little early. Perhaps, certainly the geostationary industry, the industry providing satellite capacity in the geostationary orbit, obviously is dominant at the moment. It provides easily 90%, if not more, 95% of capacity for commercial use in the world. And so at the moment, it's perhaps more dominant. Perhaps in 4 years' time, that will feel a little bit different. That balance may have shifted if and when the NGSO operators start to develop their commercial presence.
And interestingly, this issue made it to the Financial Times just a couple of days ago, which is unusual, I think, for a mainstream paper like that to consider something that looks pretty esoteric. And the view that they took there, and not necessarily one we subscribe to, but it's an interesting view, was that actually this was more a political thing and a concern that the LEO satellite space was being increasingly dominated by the US, mostly Starlink and SpaceX, and also Kuiper to some degree. And actually, this was other countries pushing back against US dominance. And the only way they could do that was effectively through restricting the ability of technical studies to make a change, which sounds like the wrong way to use technical studies. Technical studies should always be, the truth, the science behind things, and then you use them as part of the decision-making process. But interestingly, that they subscribe politics to this, and of course, politics does have an impact in many of these decisions and how many of the WRC items play out.
Yeah, so I think it does play a part. In this case, I think it was a smaller part, though. You mentioned about the US dominance, but in fact, OneWeb is part owned by Eutelsat and by the UK government, and so there's a strong UK or European interest in at least one of these systems being built. So I would say that it wasn't necessarily driven by US dominance, but I think there was a much stronger feeling around the world, actually, that the geostationary orbit was still to be protected. And that there was still a greater interest in protecting that, and perhaps that the NGSO industry hasn't yet proven that it is going to provide the capacity or needs the capacity that would be liberated by any change in regulation at this point. So perhaps I think perhaps it was a little bit of politics, but also a little bit of kind of reality that actually this may not be the moment to do it, and that perhaps at a later time is the time to actually reconsider it.
Yeah, which makes sense. Because despite the fact that Starlink is up there, this whole idea of the really large-scale LEO constellations is still a pretty new one, and they still do have to prove themselves commercially. But effectively, we've now set an 8-year time period before any change could actually happen. If it's not out at the next WRC, it would have to be the WRC after that. Is that too long? A lot can happen in 8 years.
I wouldn't want to gaze into a crystal ball on that one, but I think it's not unusual, particularly in the satellite industry, for things to perhaps move less quickly than is predicted. Yes. And obviously, if I'm building a system, I'm obviously projecting its potential upsides and its uptake, but in practice, it may be longer to actually see these systems start to take hold in the commercial world and to take over. So I think, in satellite terms, 8 years is not that long, really, for these kind of systems to start to change and to see a transition. Because, of course, remember, operators today of geostationary equipment would have to go out and buy new terminals, new equipment to move over to these NGSO platforms. And so we will inevitably see a kind of a gradual transition rather than a sort of a mass move. I think in the consumer world, you see bigger, sort of more quick, more rapid shifts. But I think in the commercial world, I think it will be slightly slower. Yeah.
And we have to remember things like cellular systems tend to work on a 10-year cycle. So actually, these kind of durations are quite normal for the infrastructure elements. As you said, handsets can change more quickly. Software running over them can change very quickly, but the infrastructure itself takes longer. So talking about long-term infrastructure, one of the elements that was addressing a really long-term infrastructure was Agenda Item 1.4, which is looking at broadcasting and looking at the terrestrial broadcast networks in the UHF band, so roughly 470 to about 700 megahertz, which of course have been there for 50 years or more in some cases, and are still in some countries going strong. And there's been a progressive trend over the years to gradually squeeze them. So the 800 megahertz band that was used for 4G was originally part of that UHF TV broadcasting band. The 700 megahertz band that's now being used for 5G, equally part of that. And to some degree, this was a question about whether do you take the next small step and grab a 600 megahertz band, or do you just take the bigger step and take the whole of broadcasting out? Or indeed, do you do neither and leave broadcasting in place? And a bit like the upper 6 gigahertz band, the outcome there has been very regionalized with quite different outcomes in different parts of the world. In some cases, there's been a secondary allocation to mobile, which means that it's sort of a signpost that mobile might, over time, gradually move in there. In some countries, there's been a primary allocation, but only for the 600 megahertz upper slither, which is primarily the Middle Eastern countries. There's been a whole load of sort of national opt-out and changes around the world. And again, it feels like a bit more of a fragmentation of global consensus and moving more towards a national basis. But perhaps this one's a bit more tricky than the upper 6 gigahertz band, because at those frequencies, the signals do go further and you do need cross-border management of signals. So it'll be interesting to see quite how that all plays out. But it's starting to feel again like, in order to try and reach enough of a consensus to move ahead, there's had to be so many different regional and national opt-outs and agreements that actually what we're ending up with is something that's not particularly an ITU decision anymore and more a regional or a national decision.
Yeah, no, definitely that's the case. But it's very clear in a conference like WRC, you can see and hear from administrations that the different emphasis on different frequency bands and the different needs sometimes in a lot of cases. And certainly from my perspective, what I hear countries saying is that they want these lower bands, these sort of lower UHF bands for coverage in order to cover vast areas from as few base stations as possible. And that may be important in countries perhaps which have a lot of remote regions, but that's much less important in a developed kind of world. And in most parts of Europe, in fact, we're looking at moving to much higher bands in order to get better reuse and shorter range perhaps from cells. And so I think there is a bit of a conflict there, but of course also the broadcasting industry itself is changing dramatically.
Indeed. And
50 years ago, the only way to get a TV signal was over the air. Nowadays you can go to satellite, but even satellite is starting to see some waning demand, and people are moving to the internet where that's available. So a lot of people are watching things kind of virtually and not in real time. So I think there's a differing demand in different parts of the world, and I think that's, you mentioned that sort of fragmentation, and I think that's fully reflected in the uptake. And although some administrations perhaps are very keen to keep broadcasting because it's a very important part of national infrastructure, they may also be the same countries that need some of these frequencies for coverage. But whether or not they need another tranche of that spectrum was to me unproven actually going in. So I think that's why we've seen those differing outcomes coming out. And obviously administrations again will go home and decide how they actually want to assign or to license those frequencies.
And I think that unproven demand is a sort of important point that underlies actually both this issue, the UHF issue, but also to some degree the upper 6 gigahertz one as well. So I agree with you. The 600 megahertz demand is quite unproven. In the US, where it has been allocated for mobile, it was auctioned a few years ago, and actually there was very little interest in that auction, and the spectrum all went to one operator. So there wasn't really the vibrant kind of competing demand that you'd see in previous bands, suggesting that perhaps mobile operators have got enough of that lower frequency spectrum. In the upper 6 gigahertz band, it's unclear whether either cellular or Wi-Fi actually need it, certainly not right now, and whether they might do into the future. So a lot of those uncertainties do require flexibility in the way that the bands are used in the future.
Yeah, no, indeed. But I think is also behind all of this, of course, there's a reflection of how our use of mobile phones has changed, and we bought a mobile phone 20 years ago and you used it for voice calls. Today, I so rarely use it for voice calls. It's mostly data is used on my phone, and that's the dominant application that I'm using it for. And I'm sure that's the case in most for many people. So I think maybe the operators are looking at it saying, well, actually, what we need is capacity to support data applications, and maybe longer range cells are less important to what our customers actually want.
Yeah.
But I suppose that's a part of the maturing of the industry.
And perhaps the last one to touch on, you mentioned long range. Extremely long range was one item you were looking at, which was Agenda Item 1.7, and the ability to effectively provide communications to aircraft, even when they're hundreds of miles away from any land base. Do you want to talk through that one a bit more? Yeah,
this was a really interesting agenda item actually, and I think it reflects the real sort of core values of the ITU and the activity of the WRC. This was looking at reusing an existing allocation that was made to aeronautical mobile at VHF. So this is a frequency band between about 117 to 136 megahertz that's used today for air traffic control. So when you fly in an aircraft, the pilot of your airplane is talking to air traffic control constantly through VHF. But the range of VHF is generally up to, let's say, about 100 miles or so, effectively. And once you're away, let's say from a land-based infrastructure, the aircraft then has to rely on other systems, HF or maybe even satellite, in order to make those communications reliably. So the agenda item was actually examining whether or not those same VHF frequencies could be used again to via satellite to effectively extend the range of VHF coverage. So rather than stopping 100 miles off the coast of a landmass, perhaps extending those out over the oceans via using satellites as the base stations to relay the signals to air traffic control. So we already have some satellite systems that provide those in other frequency bands. The benefit here, when it's implemented, the benefit will be that every aircraft will use the same radio equipment.
Yeah.
It already has a VHF radio on it,
Yeah.
usually 2 or 3 on a commercial airliner, and therefore it's already equipped to communicate on those frequencies. It requires no new equipment. The challenge identified in the studies was actually ensuring that the satellite use of these frequencies wouldn't interfere or in any way restrict the operation of the terrestrial infrastructure, because obviously that's quite critical for flight safety, for landing and takeoff of aircraft and maintaining separation of aircraft. So that's very critical to safety today. And so the studies were really focusing in on what was needed in order to, what decisions were needed for regulatory purposes to make sure that interference didn't occur. There was no risk of harm to the existing infrastructure.
Which, as you said, is exactly the sort of thing that ITU should be doing and is good at doing through these kind of conferences.
Yeah, it was as I say, a bit of a showcase really for what the ITU can do, which is effective. It also highlighted the separation of the ITU creating allocations and conditions for, in this case, satellite operation alongside terrestrial operation. So it defined a number of regulatory conditions that the satellite operators had to follow in order to ensure protection, and in particular giving administrations a role in coordinating that activity. But it also highlighted the more operational nature that ICAO plays in using these frequencies. Yeah. ICAO is heavily involved in planning the frequency of individual administrations and airports, for example, and they will play a role in managing the frequency sort of operations between the satellite component and the terrestrial component. So the work doesn't stop at the WRC. Yeah. The allocations and, if you like, the headline regulation has been created, and now it's to ICAO to create the more operational day-to-day frequency management that will allow these systems to be implemented and to be used effectively.
And talking about the work stopping or not stopping, 4 years till the next WRC. When do you start working on the agenda items for that?
So not far now, actually. The ITU will begin its cycle, I believe, in about April time. There's 1 or 2 meetings earlier than that, but the majority of the work will begin around April time. And the various working parties that have already been assigned work for the next conference will begin to do those studies and prepare for that. And there's a number of new agenda items, I think, which will be of interest to many people.
Yes, a lot going on, particularly in the satellite space, direct-to handsets, all those other kind of areas that they're going to need study.
Yeah, indeed. Well, there's two satellite agenda items actually with respect to mobile satellite communications, and as you mentioned already, the direct-to-device is a very interesting concept, and that's a proposal to actually allow satellites to use the same frequencies that your cellular handset uses already. And again, a bit like the case we just talked about with aircraft, the idea would be where a cellular network doesn't cover, so let's say in a very remote part of a country where they don't have base station infrastructure, perhaps a satellite could actually provide, through a satellite beam, provide a connection direct to a handset on the frequencies that your regular 5G or 4G handset already uses. Yes. And so the problem there is, well, there are a few issues, technical issues there about how that will be done without interfering with the terrestrial base station, terrestrial operations. But also the question is who has control of that? Who has control of those frequencies? And obviously the satellite operator maybe hasn't bought a license in a particular country. The terrestrial operator has a domestic license and has paid for a domestic license and clearly wants to maintain control of that. So there's a technical, there's also also perhaps an operational, technical and operational issues to be resolved there.
And I can see there'll be a lot of resolution needed on those.
Indeed. But in addition to that, there's a new agenda item to look at new MSS, mobile satellite frequencies. We've seen an increase in the use of the existing allocations. There is particular interest for sort of low data rate type of IoT, Internet of Things type applications, and many new industries are kind of popping up around those kind of applications to allow all manner of kind of low rate data but continuous availability, global availability for things like tracking and for monitoring, remote monitoring of infrastructure. And the cost, importantly, the cost of the equipment and the cost of bandwidth is dropping quite quickly, and that of course is then opening the market up even further.
Yeah. Excellent. So plenty to talk about. I think we'll have to leave it there. We could have talked about a number of other agenda items, but I think we've covered some of the more interesting ones. Mike, thanks very much for chatting to me.
Thank you, William.